Today I'm going to look at a very special train. It ran once a day from a platform that was closed, along a line that wasn't officially served by passenger trains, to a station that was barely used. For a lot of its history, it wasn't even listed in the timetable, at least not in any of the publicly available ones. It was run for the convenience of certain government employees, and they called it the Kenny Belle. Staff also referred to it as the Winkle. You know, maybe I should have started with the name and worked backwards there. So what was the Kenny Belle? It was a special that ran from Clapham Junction to Kensington Olympia twice in the mornings and back the other way twice in the evening. It ran over the West London line. It was a very short train, run primarily to carry workers to and from the Post Office Savings Bank in Blythe House. This building here. A typical train was 2 to 4 coaches. The train was operational for many years. I guess we could say that it unofficially began in 1916. That was when passenger services over the unpopular West London Extension Railway were cut back, so they only ran between Clapham Junction and Olympia. But it really becomes interesting in October 1940, when they stopped advertising it and it became a ghost train, so to speak. There are rumours that the apparent secrecy was because MI5 employees were using the service, and Blythe House had a special division for mail that required, shall we say, a higher level of discretion. But seriously, it was secret because no one bothered to advertise it, because it wasn't intended for public use. To be honest, any train service that doesn't make much economic sense is probably going to get a sinister rumour attached to it. Don't get me wrong, there have been plenty of sinister and secret trains over the years, but the Kenny Belle wasn't one of them. And there have been plenty of train services that don't make much sense, because politics. In any case, the idea that it was a super-secret, eyes-only train doesn't make much sense, because between June 1951 and June 1956, it was advertised again. At the time, it was looking like the Post Office Savings Bank was going to move to Glasgow, so I assume the idea was that British Railways wanted to see how valuable it was to the regular travelling public. It may not have been advertised, but if you knew about it, you could ride it. Workers at the Lion's Cake Factory, very near to Olympia, also used the service, as did a number of school children, and of course, rail enthusiasts who wanted to experience this weird train. The service ran from Platform 1 at Clapham Junction, which is now Platform 17, but back then was closed off. To get to it, you had to leave the main station entrance and then re-enter through a side entrance. But I've also come across accounts that say that it left from Platform 1 on the other side of the station, the actual Platform 1, which is now abandoned, and the train came back to Platform 17. It's all very confusing, possibly it changed over the years. The nickname was kind of ironic. Unlike the Devon Belle or the Brighton Belle, this was a very unglamorous train, very low priority. As such, it tended to be made up of whatever rolling stock was available. Now, here I am going to get into proper train nerd territory, which some of you will like and some of you won't, so, bear with me. So in steam days, the train was typically hauled by a medium-sized tank engine, an Ivat 262 or a standard Class 4. It was also a common term for the South Eastern and Chatham Railway's H-Class, which were built between 1904 and 1915. That being said, there are also accounts of the unusual-looking Q1s being used on the service, and even express locomotives showing up now and again. The coaches, too, were a mixed bag. Again, it seems to have been whatever they had lying around. Antiquated rolling stock might be pressed into service, including a set of South Eastern and Chatham Railway coaches that had been converted from a rail motor. Perhaps one of the most unusual was coach number S1000S, which was an experimental one-off made of plastic. Later on they used a 6TC unit, which again was an experimental prototype coach set. The West London line was infamously unpopular and wasn't electrified. Actually, the Kenny Belle wound up being the last steam-hauled passenger service in London. In later years, the service was taken over by diesels, typically a Class 33 or Class 73, although in the 1990s a Class 205 was used. Or, again, whatever they had lying around in the carriage sidings at Clapham Junction. In 1963 it was one of the few London services that was recommended to be cut in the infamous Beeching Report. Yet it survived, just. Conspiracy theorists might like to use this as further evidence of sinister purpose, but London generally wound up being mostly spared by the Axeman. And it wasn't as if no one used it. The area around Olympia underwent a lot of commercial development in the 60s. So by the end of the decade, it wasn't only post office workers using the train. That being said, the train was typically cancelled if the allocated rolling stock was needed on a more popular route. But traffic did increase to the point where in 1969 the service once again reappeared on the timetable, and there it stayed. In the early 1970s, the Post Office Savings Bank finally did move away from Olympia, but by now there was enough demand to keep trains going without its employees. I should also point out that at this time there was a bus service that covered the route too, so it wasn't as if there were no options for commuters. In fact, from 1983 the service was increased from 2 trains to 4 in each direction. By the 1990s it was 11 each way, even if the trains used were elderly Class 117 diesel multiple units. In 1993 demand was judged to be such that the line was finally electrified. In 2007, the West London line became part of the Overground, joining what's now an extensive and well-used network of commuter lines and taking trains far beyond Olympia. Was this the end of the Kenny Belle? It's hard to say when a service that never officially existed begins and ends. You could argue that it finished when the post office moved out because it was no longer for the benefit of their workers. You could argue that it was when it started appearing in the timetable and was no longer a ghost train. You might say that it was in 1983 when it was officially popular enough to require more trains. Whoever was responsible for ending it, oh my god, they killed the Kenny. I hope you enjoyed today's video and will consider clicking that like button accordingly and maybe subscribing for more. As ever, I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon for being the London Overground to my underused commuter line. Anyway, I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.